James and Sarah McAllister thought they were living the perfect suburban life. But one quiet night, their world was shattered by a mysterious intruder who seemed to know everything about them. With only a chilling mask left behind as a clue, they soon realized the nightmare wasn't just about a break-in, it was about a deep, twisted connection to their past. As the investigation unfolded, the McAllisters discovered that the face behind the mask was someone they had tried to help years ago, someone they never thought they'd see again. The question wasn't just who had broken in, but why had he chosen them? On a cold, quiet evening in November 2018, in a small suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of a major city, the McAllister family settled in for what seemed like any other ordinary night. The air had that crisp bite to it, signaling the slow shift from autumn to winter. As dusk fell, the neighborhood grew quieter, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of passing cars breaking the silence. In the McAllisters' home, the evening routine was comforting in its predictability. James McAllister, a father of two, had just finished reading his children's bedtime stories. His son Lucas and daughter Emma had both been especially energetic that evening, eager to talk about their school day and the new friends they had made. After tucking them in and checking that their nightlights were on, James kissed them goodnight, as he did every night. Sarah, his wife, was already in bed. She had been reading a book, curled up in the warmth of their bedroom, and was looking forward to the peaceful end of a long week. James kissed Sarah goodnight and headed downstairs to prepare for the next day. The house was an older one, with creaky floors and charming but aging fixtures that gave it character. The walls were lined with family photographs, and the smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the kitchen from earlier in the day. Sarah, settling into bed, felt a wave of drowsiness wash over her. She read a few more pages, but soon she too drifted off into a deep sleep. The night was still. There were no signs of life in the neighborhood, no barking dogs or passing cars. The faint glow of street lights outside filtered in through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the rooms. The sound of the occasional wind tapping against the windows was the only noise that kept the silence from feeling absolute. For all intents and purposes, it was the kind of night where everything seemed perfectly normal. Nothing seemed out of place. But that calm was deceptive. At 3:22 a.m., a faint but distinct shadow crossed the McAllisters' driveway. The motion-activated floodlights on the side of their house flickered on for a moment, illuminating the dark yard. Sarah stirred slightly in her sleep, hearing the subtle sound of the lights flickering on. But when she opened her eyes, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. She assumed it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, something common for the area. She tried to shake off the feeling, rolling over to face her side of the bed, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. James, who was a heavy sleeper, didn't stir. The house, for the most part, was undisturbed. But somewhere in the shadows, hidden behind the curtains and the dim glow of the hallway light, an intruder was already inside. The basement window, which had been left unlocked the day before when James had gone down to fetch holiday decorations, was the entry point. The intruder moved swiftly and silently, so much so that even the sensitive motion detectors outside had only briefly registered their presence. By the time Sarah had glanced at the window, everything had returned to its quiet, still state. She thought nothing of it. But the intruder was patient, methodical. They had chosen this moment, this house, this family, not randomly but with careful precision. The events of that night were only beginning to unfold. In the hours that followed, the McAllisters remained blissfully unaware of the intruder lurking in their midst. The house, a place of comfort and safety, still echoed with the remnants of the day's ordinary routines. But all of that was about to change. As the night deepened, the intruder moved through the house like a shadow, unseen but always present. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a distant noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that could have easily been dismissed. But Sarah woke with a start, her senses tingling with a strange discomfort. It was a feeling she couldn't quite place, an instinctive prickling at the back of her neck. She had been dreaming, but now, fully awake, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. She glanced toward the clock. It was 3:50 a.m. James, deeply asleep beside her, remained unaware of the disturbance. But Sarah's mind kept racing. She lay still in bed, listening. There it was again, a slight creak from somewhere down the hallway. Her pulse quickened. It was faint, almost as if someone was walking softly. But there was no reason for anyone to be awake at this hour. Not in their house. She waited a moment, her heart beating louder in her ears. Had one of the kids gotten out of bed? She hesitated before getting up, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Yet when she opened her bedroom door and peered down the hallway, all was quiet. The dim light from the stairway cast a pale glow on the floor, revealing nothing out of place. The house was silent again, save for the occasional ticking of the clock. She told herself it was nothing, maybe the house settling, or the wind brushing against the windows. Still, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She closed the door and climbed back into bed, attempting to push the unsettling feeling aside. But sleep wouldn't come. Not now. In the stillness of the house, the intruder continued their slow and methodical movements. They were inside, not a trace of sound marking their steps. There was no rushing, no panic, only quiet calculation. Every action was deliberate, as though they had rehearsed it 1,000 times. The intruder knew this house. They knew its layout, its weaknesses. The unlocked basement window had been the key to gaining access, and now the intruder moved upward, silently climbing the stairs that led to the main floor. It wasn't just random. It was personal. The intruder paused at the top of the staircase, listening. The house was still. The family was asleep. There was a sense of power in that stillness. For a moment they simply stood there, observing the peaceful scene before them. The McAllisters were just a family in their home, living out their normal lives. They had no idea of the danger lurking only feet away. The intruder continued down the hallway toward the bedrooms, carefully stepping around the creaky floorboards. There was no urgency, no need to hurry. This was a game. This was about control. Every movement was precise, and yet strangely there was no real intent to cause harm, at least not yet. The intruder's goal wasn't theft or violence, but something more unsettling: fear. The McAllisters were simply pawns in a much larger game, one where the rules were being rewritten in real time. The intruder's presence in the house wasn't an accident. This was a plan in motion, and it had been for a long time. The McAllisters, unwittingly, had become part of something far more complex than they could imagine. As Sarah lay in her bed, unable to shake the creeping sense of dread, she had no idea that the true nightmare had already begun. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the McAllister household. The warmth of the sun was a welcome contrast to the chill of the night that had passed, a night that at first glance seemed like nothing more than an uneventful stretch of hours. But Sarah McAllister couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Her mind kept returning to the strange noise she had heard in the middle of the night, the soft footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, and the lingering sense of unease that had kept her awake long after she had tried to fall back to sleep. She tried to put it out of her mind as she went about her morning routine. It was a Saturday, a day she usually cherished for its simplicity. The kids were still asleep, and James was already up, making his morning coffee in the kitchen. But as Sarah moved through the house, a growing sense of discomfort gnawed at her. She walked through the living room on her way to the kitchen, and it was then that her eyes caught something out of place. A chair that was usually tucked neatly under the table had been moved. Not a lot, but enough for her to notice. The chair's back was now facing the window, the soft sunlight streaming in, casting odd shadows across the room. Her pulse quickened, and she paused in the doorway, her gaze darting over the room. Everything else seemed in order. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed in any significant way. But there was something about the arrangement of the chair that felt wrong. It was as if someone had been here, had been sitting in that chair, and had purposely left it that way. She walked toward it, her heart pounding. As she moved closer, she noticed something else. The curtains, which were always drawn tightly shut to keep the morning light at bay, were now slightly parted. The sliver between them revealed the backyard, where the garden sat under a thin layer of frost. But it wasn't the view outside that caught her attention, it was the faintness of the movement, a shift in the air that suggested someone had been standing right there, looking out the window. Sarah's stomach twisted. She stepped closer to the window, half expecting to see some shadow or figure lurking just outside, but there was nothing. The backyard was empty, still, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the space had been disturbed in some way, as if someone had been watching them, watching her family. Her unease turned to dread as she stepped back and scanned the room once more. The coffee table had also been moved slightly. There, resting atop it, was a small black mask. A child's mask, but dark, almost sinister in its design. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the first time she had seen something like this. It was the same kind of mask that had been left behind in other break-ins in the neighborhood, reported by other families who had been victims of strange, unexplained intrusions. The mask on the coffee table was the final piece in a puzzle Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to solve. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What did it mean? Why was it here, in her living room? And who had left it? She called out for James, who was still in the kitchen, his back turned as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The moment he walked into the room and saw the mask, his face went pale. I don't know what to think," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. She had been trying to dismiss the strange feeling that had plagued her throughout the night, but now, with the mask in front of her, it all seemed too real. The quiet footsteps, the chair out of place, the curtains drawn back as if someone had been watching them. James immediately contacted the police, his calm demeanor masking a growing sense of fear. The officers arrived soon after, and a forensic team combed through the house, taking photographs and documenting everything. Yet, despite their thorough search, nothing seemed to be missing. No valuables, no electronics, no signs of forced entry. The only thing out of place was the mask, which seemed to carry with it an ominous weight. It was clear now that this wasn't just an ordinary break-in. It wasn't about theft or vandalism. The intruder had been here for something else, something far more unsettling. As the police worked to gather evidence, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the nightmare had only just begun, and that whatever had been left behind in her home was a message, a warning that something darker, more dangerous, was still to come. In the days that followed the discovery of the mask, the McAllisters found themselves trapped in a strange, suspended state of fear and disbelief. The police had taken the mask for analysis, but beyond that, there were few answers. The forensic team had found no fingerprints, no other physical evidence, and certainly no sign of forced entry. Everything in the house seemed undisturbed, as though the intruder had been in and out without leaving a trace. Yet the sense of violation lingered, suffocating the family's once innocent life. For Sarah, it became impossible to shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, felt amplified in the silence of the house. She began to double-check the locks, inspect the windows, and listen carefully for any unusual noises at night. But despite her vigilance, nothing seemed to alleviate the growing sense of dread that settled like a heavy cloud over the home. She couldn't stop herself from imagining the worst, that the person who had left the mask behind would return, or worse, was already watching them again. James, too, felt the weight of the strange events, though he tried his best to keep a calm demeanor for the sake of his family. He went to work, but his mind was never fully on his job. He couldn't help but replay the small details in his mind, how quiet everything had been, how the intruder had moved with such purpose, and how the mask, the most unsettling clue of all, had been left in plain sight. It wasn't just a symbol of fear. It felt like a message. But what was the message? Who was this person, and why were they targeting his family? The police continued their investigation but had little to go on. There was nothing about the mask that could be traced. No fingerprints, no markings. The oddest part was that, in the months leading up to the incident, there had been similar break-ins in the area, all of them eerily similar to what had happened in the McAllisters' home. In each case, the intruder had left behind a mask, always a black, childlike mask, but slightly different in shape or design each time. It was clear that the intruder was not interested in valuables or personal gain. This wasn't about theft. It was something else, something far more insidious. As the days passed, the sense of normalcy seemed more and more elusive. The kids, Lucas and Emma, had begun to ask questions. They had heard whispers in the neighborhood about a masked intruder and had started to wonder why Mommy and Daddy were so tense all the time. Sarah and James did their best to reassure them. But the truth was that they no longer felt safe in their own home. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every dark corner a place for someone to hide. Then, one evening, something happened that would finally push the investigation into a new direction. A local reporter, digging into the pattern of break-ins, uncovered an unsettling link between the McAllisters' family and the other victims in the neighborhood. The common thread was James McAllister's involvement with a youth outreach program, a program that years earlier had included troubled teens from the area. Adam Kline, a teenager who had once been a participant in that program, was mentioned in a series of old case files. He had dropped out of the program years ago after a violent altercation, and no one had heard from him since. But the reporter's research uncovered something even more chilling. The exact type of mask left at the McAllisters' home had been a gift to the youth program years earlier. James had been a volunteer at the time, and the mask had been part of a project designed to help the kids explore their creative sides. The idea was to make masks to express their emotions, a therapeutic exercise. James had been part of that initiative, helping the teens connect with their feelings and develop self-expression through art. It dawned on the investigators and then on James with terrifying clarity. The intruder wasn't just some random criminal. This was someone who had been a part of that program, a troubled teen, perhaps, who had been influenced by the lessons of the past, but twisted them into something far darker. And one person stood out above all others: Adam Kline. The police soon traced Kline's whereabouts. He had left town years ago, after the altercation, but his name kept popping up in various reports of break-ins in the area. The pattern was becoming clearer now. Adam had disappeared, but in his wake, something far more dangerous had been brewing. The Batman mask, the mask that was left behind in the McAllisters' home, wasn't just a symbol. It was a message for James, for Sarah, for their children. The police had now uncovered the truth. Adam Kline had been waiting, planning, and watching for years. The McAllisters had been drawn into his web, victims of an old grudge that was now playing out in terrifying real time. The news hit the McAllisters like a cold wave. Adam Kline. The name seemed so distant at first, like an old ghost from the past that no one had thought about for years. But now, as the investigation deepened, it became clear that Adam was more than just a forgotten face. He was the center of a dark, twisted story that had been unfolding right under their noses. Adam had been one of the troubled teens James had worked with years ago, when he volunteered at the local youth outreach program. James had always seen potential in the kids, even the ones like Adam, who had a reputation for being difficult and troubled. Adam had come from a broken home, and James remembered trying to reach him, trying to give him the tools he needed to make something of himself. But somewhere along the way, things had gone terribly wrong. The violent altercation that had ended Adam's time in the program had been a breaking point. Adam had been expelled after an outburst that involved another teen. There were no details about the event that James could recall clearly, only that it had been unsettling, and Adam had left the program in a cloud of tension. After that, Adam disappeared from the community. His name faded from the local headlines, and everyone moved on. But the scars from that time had never left Adam. The more the police dug into Adam's background, the clearer it became that his obsession with James had festered over the years. Adam had kept track of the McAllisters, learning everything about their lives, about James's work, his family, his home. It was unsettling to think that all these years, Adam had been lurking in the shadows of their quiet suburban life. The Batman mask, the one left behind at their house, was a haunting symbol of the years of bitterness and resentment that had built up inside him. The breakthrough came when the police traced Adam's last known address to an abandoned house on the edge of town, just a few miles away from the McAllisters' home. The house was dilapidated, neglected, and seemingly untouched by time. It was as if Adam had created a little world for himself there, isolated from the world he once knew. When the police raided the property, they found it disturbingly organized, with hundreds of pages of notes and journals documenting his life and his obsession with the McAllisters. It was clear now that Adam hadn't just been seeking revenge for his expulsion from the program. He had been watching them, studying them, preparing for this moment. Inside the house, they found not just journals, but a series of masks, some unfinished, others carefully crafted. Each one bore a different symbol, a different expression, but they all had the same haunting theme: masks, as a means of hiding one's true self. Adam had been building a persona for himself, something much darker than what he had been before. He had become the Batman, not just as a costume, but as a mask to hide the real Adam Kline, a mask that allowed him to creep into homes, to instill fear, and to torment those who had unknowingly been part of his twisted past. When the police finally arrested Adam, he didn't put up a fight. He had been waiting for this moment, it seemed, almost as if it had all been part of the plan. His arrest brought no relief to the McAllisters. They couldn't escape the knowledge that someone who had once been so close to their lives, someone they had tried to help, had turned into their worst nightmare. The trial that followed was a media frenzy. Adam was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted burglary. But the charges could never capture the full extent of the horror he had inflicted on the McAllisters. What he had done to them went far beyond physical trespass. It had been about control, about power, about forcing them to relive the pain of their own lives through his eyes. The masks had been his way of telling them, without words, that they were all part of the same game. In the end, Adam was sentenced to life in prison, but the scars remained for the McAllisters. They moved from their home, unable to shake the feeling that their lives had been forever altered by the events of that one night. For them, the Batman intruder was no longer just a figure of fear. It was a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lie beneath even the most ordinary of lives. They would never truly be able to return to the way things were before. The masks, the watching, the waiting, it had all left a permanent mark on them, one they would carry for the rest of their lives.